to the world as part of this summit, because it is so important. Any of us who've ever been to a site will have used a toilet, been to a shop, gone through the door, been in the car park. All of these things and more will be relevant to this discussion. Not one of us hasn't interacted with it. So it's brilliant to be talking about this with our panel. I'm going to allow our panel to introduce themselves because they will do a much better job than I ever could. And as part of their introductions, they're going to tell us who they are, where they currently are or previously were in terms of operations roles, and also a bit about what their career path into heritage operations has been. And I think I will start with Robin.
Hi everyone, I'm Robin Greenwood and I am currently the Exhibitions and Collections Officer for the Royal Shakespeare Company. So a slightly different take than the rest of the panel today. So the Royal Shakespeare Company, I think most people may know, is a theatre company primarily, but we do have a museum collection, and I am responsible for the care and access of that collection. So that's what I do now. Bit of everything, operations in that role, as well as collections, management and care. But I started off actually in a museum in Canada, a historic house, where I did everything from day-to-day management to volunteer to staff to shop to everything you can imagine. Then I came over to the UK, and I also had an operations role at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, where I worked in their operations team for 2 of the historic houses for them. Again, doing lots of day-to-day management, interpretation, managing guides, site management, yes, lots of different toilet questions and stuff like that. Yeah, so that's a bit about me and my operations background.
Thank you. I think we're going to see a lot through this session about how operations is intersecting with all the other areas of work in a museum, and I will definitely be coming back to a couple of questions about that. Andrew, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning for me. As Louise said, it's 7:05 here in the United States. My name is Andrew Coulomb. I'm currently the Director of Operations and Capital Projects at the Valentine in Richmond, Virginia. We are a museum that is dedicated to the story of the city of Richmond. We're roughly about 200 years old. We started as kind of a cabinet of curiosities in an old row house in downtown Richmond, and now we're a little more professional. So not much though. My career in operations started about a decade ago. Completely by happenstance. I was a history major in college, and I didn't want to do the 2 things that American history majors are expected to do, which is go to law school or become a teacher. I didn't want to do either of those 2 things, and so I interned at a museum, and I'd always loved museums, and I was instantly hooked by the nuts and bolts of it, the intricacies that you don't always see, like, you know, how is that secured to the wall? How do we make sure that X, Y, or Z occurs without people seeing it? So I ended up working at that museum, which was the Virginia Holocaust Museum, also here in Richmond, Virginia. And I was there for about 5 years as their deputy director, and then eventually their interim executive director. Then I moved to Virginia Beach, which is not too far from here, and I was the director of operations and facility management for the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art. Throughout that span, I mean, I've had finance responsibilities, insurance responsibilities, shops, toilets, all kinds of stuff. Like you said, it intersects everything. So that's a little bit about my experience.
Lovely, thank you so much. David, would you like to go next?
Hi everyone, so I'm David Hingley. I'm head of visitor experience at the moment at Tate, Tate Modern and Tate Britain. Gosh, that means I'm kind of involved in just about everything that's going on those 2 sites. I've been there kind of 1.5 years. My team that I'm actually daily accountable for are the staff you see in the galleries, the visitor assistants, the duty management team, who look after all the kind of major incident planning. All the stuff you hope won't happen on your day out is what we plan for, so that you don't have the worst possible day out. And then I also look after the volunteers team. We've got about 450 volunteers across the 2 sites. So kind of quite wide ranging. As the others have said, lots of crossover with other departments. My role, I like to say sometimes, is a little bit like being Cilla Black, for those of you who remember. I'm quite often introducing parts of the organization to other parts and saying, do you know what they're doing? Because it might work together. So there's a lot of that. Slightly different career path, actually. I did a degree in history, like Andrew, and my parents said, what will you do with that? I really wanted to work in heritage, couldn't get a job initially, and so ended up selling carrots. I was a fruit and veg manager for Sainsbury's. Then I went on and thought I'd have a crack at selling clothes, so I ended up as a store manager at Marks and Spencer's, and I'd kind of given up hope, and then had an opportunity to apply for a job at Hampton Court Palace, which I thought, hey, maybe I'll get an interview and I get to see behind the scenes, and that'll make my day, because I was a regular visitor and a member and loved it. And they took a gamble, and so I was head of visitor services there, which then kind of morphed into head of operations, as they realized I spent nearly as much time sorting the toilets out as I did dealing with the visitors. And then I did a brief stint as Chief Operating Officer for the Landmark Trust, which you may be aware is an independent charity that rescues buildings that are not big enough to be visitor attractions and turns them into places you can stay. So you can pretend you're a lighthouse keeper or Lord of the Manor for a long weekend. The downside of that for me was you don't get to see the visitors having a great time, because the last person they want to see on their holiday is the Chief Operating Officer. So hence the move back into what I'm doing now with Tate.
Thank you. I think toilets are going to come up a lot. If anyone's got a bingo card, now's the time. Jim, how about you?
Hi, I'm Jim Lowe. The last job I had, which was about this time last year, was head of operations at the National Railway Museum. Probably the best way of describing that was the job purpose in the job description, which was to ensure that the museum had the resources and tools it needed to offer a world-class visitor experience 365 days of the year. So again, like everyone else, massive interaction with everything going on across the site, directly managing visitor experience, volunteering, house services, and also being the Railway Museum, rail operations and engineering. Actually a similar career path, I think, to David. I started working life in betting shops, part-time. I then went to the wonderful world of supermarkets, and I started as a part-time shelf filler, worked my way up into a management position, did that for many years. And I didn't actually come into the heritage world of museums until I was about 32. The time I was working for supermarkets, though, I had a love of history. I was also working as a part-time guide at Cardiff Castle, which enabled me to discover an opportunity, and I became a duty manager at Cardiff Castle. Then in a strange career twist, aged 40, I resigned my job. My wife was made redundant. We sold up and we just moved to York because we thought York will have heritage jobs. I went back into supermarkets for a bit, and eventually got a position with the National Trust, which I did for a while. And then from there, I went to the Science Museum Group as a visitor experience manager at the National Rail Museum. Did a stint as well with visitor experience at the National Science and National Science and Media Museum, and became head of operations in 2013.
Thank you. I think transferable skills is another thing we're going to be picking up on a lot. A lot of the skills in operations are not heritage specific. And I think, Will, you also are likely to mention that in your intro.
Hi, everyone. My name is Will Tregaskes. I'm Museum Co-ordinator at Cynon Valley Museum in Aberdeen, South Wales. We're a small museum set up to reopen the museum in 2016. My role is broad. Working in a small team, I do a daily operation of the site. I manage a volunteer team, the internal income streams, and the exhibition program. My career history, after graduating, I briefly tried to work as a freelance archaeologist and realized quickly that my knees couldn't take it, and worked in front of house, working as a visitor services assistant at the Roman Baths in Bath. And sort of as I progressed there, I the role at Cynon Valley Museum came up, and I applied there and sort of have worked in that role alongside other 0-hour contracts in the past, but now I'm fully at Cynon Valley Museum.
Thank you. I'm going to come on to my first question. I'm going to go straight in with the real talk, the most difficult question I could possibly ask someone in operations. What do you do all day? I'm going to pick on David first, I think, for this one.
I just sit there waiting for the phone to go from another department so that I can support them. Sometimes it feels like that's an expectation, actually. I genuinely think when you work in operations, that phrase, like, no day will be the same, is absolutely true. And you see that when you're going for careers all over the place. And it's, I have to say, it's not true in a lot of worlds. In my supermarket life, it was pretty much the same every day. So the key bit is about making sure that the buildings, usually when we're open, are up and running, that they're presentable for the visitors, that we've made sure they're safe, that we've got the team in, that the visitor assistants are up to date with what's going on the floor, what new exhibitions we've got, what's going on the site on that day. So there's a lot of looking after people, frankly. I think that's the key thing. We look after people, and that's visitors and our staff. So we're making sure we're presentable, we're safe, everything's as it should be. And that's kind of the day-to-day rolling, the doors open. Quite often people will have a meeting at 10 o'clock that we won't be able to attend because 10 o'clock's when we open on our sites. And I think that's kind of common for a lot of operational teams. But at the same time, we have to be thinking ahead. So the other part of my day is usually, I've been in meetings today, for example, about exhibitions coming up in a year, 2 years' time, and giving advice on how those could work for visitor flow, how many people we can get in the lifts at a certain time to a certain place. So it's a kind of two-pronged. It's living really in the moment. And maybe sometimes I've got a radio as well, and the radio might go during the meeting and I have to nip off and deal with something at the same time as being there to kind of think ahead for, you know, how we're going to shape the future days that we're going to be dealing with. So that's the mix of my job, really, and that's just part of it.
Yeah, definitely a lot of variety. And Andrew, I saw you nodding there. I think I might come to you next. Is that represent your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, David really hit a lot of the buttons. I've also experienced it all depends on the organization that you're at. So when I was at the Virginia Holocaust Museum, they were a very young institution. So it was a lot of, for me in my position there, it was a lot of policy creation and shepherding departments. So creating departments. They didn't have a security department at all when I arrived. So that was, my boss turned to me like in month 2 and was like, hey, you should do that. And I was like, all right, fine. So it all depends on kind of the institution you're at. But yeah, that age-old saying that no day is the same is absolutely true. Ever since college, I would write down 5 things that I want to accomplish in a day. And just like, if I just accomplish those 5 things, that's a good day. That hasn't happened since I've gotten into museum operations. It's always like 1 or 2 is always left unchecked because it's, yesterday the phones went down for, I don't even know why, but they did. So I'm rushing out of a meeting or something like that to figure out why in the world, and I'm not a phone expert, I just have to figure it out. So I think that it's a big part of being able to be agile and being able to kind of shift gears really quickly. Being in a meeting and switching to trying to put out a fire is a pretty abrupt change in mindset, but it's an important skill to have. And so who knows what today will bring. I have an extra like 2 hours in my day being up this early, so we'll see. It's gonna be fun.
I think learning how to work whilst interrupted is definitely a skill that this kind of work teaches you. I think, Robin, if I could come to you, what does a day look like for you?
Well, to be honest, the last 8 months have been on furlough. So I have got up, I ate breakfast, I let my dog out. This week I've been enjoying the Fair Museum Jobs conference. But I'm still on furlough. I've been on furlough since March from the RSC. I've come back a few times for a few weeks to do the collections management side of my job. But I think what is really real in the theatre industry at the minute is that we haven't been able to open, especially an institution of the RSC size, hasn't been, it's just wasn't economically viable to open the building. So with the building closed, it means our exhibition spaces are closed as well. So if I go back and sort of say what a day was before furlough, it's sort of interacting between what the operations team at the theatre does. So we have a large front of house operations team in the theatre, but are not necessarily sort of collection specialists. So where my role kind of comes in is I sort of become the advisor on the collection bit. So what I mean by that is like the buildings that we keep our collections in, I'm the person that really interacts with the estates department to say what kind of conditions we need to be in terms of when we created our exhibition in 2016 in the main building. I was part of the team who advised our operations team on all of the things that sort of David was saying, you know, customer flow, toilets, interpretation, volunteers. I run the placement program for the collection and the volunteers bit for the collection at the RSC as well. But yes, at the moment I'm still on furlough, and I haven't been able to start thinking about how we might reopen that part of the building, because yeah, we've just haven't had the money to be able to do that yet. But I'm looking forward to being part of those conversations.
No, completely understand, Robin. I think everyone has had this year. It's weird having this conversation this year when everything has been so different. Like I'm asking about a typical day, like that's a normal thing now, but it's completely not. And I know someone who knows a lot about this because they have just reopened this past weekend. I'm going to pass over to Will now, I think, on this.
Yeah, I mean, we reopened this weekend, so it's been a big change for us in terms of going back to site more often, and particularly in the preparation to reopen. And I guess a normal day now is our opening hours are shorter, so we've got more time in the morning for cleaning. We've brought in a cleaning company to help support us in the mornings to get the museum prepared. But in terms of everyday working in a small museum, operations is just a part of my role because we are a small team, and in many respects we're all working in operations because there's so few of us. There's only when we're at full capacity there's only 3.8, and currently it's just 2.8 staff across the site. And in that within the operations side, it is opening doors, it is getting the car park open to the public, it's making sure the outside's clean, brushing away pigeon poo, that sort of thing. And then obviously there's as we've already discussed multiple times, toilets, they seem to be breaking more times than they're working in so many of our sites, and making sure it's like just checking like there's enough toilet roll and making sure that the till works, the phone works, like these things, make sure everything's plugged in right. It's things just happen and you have to respond to them, and I think combined with working in a small museum where no day is already the same, adding that element of operations to it just means your day is entirely unpredictable. You have no idea what's going to happen.
Definitely. I think with a lot of operations things, it's the things that people, if they're working fine, nobody will notice them. But as soon as they aren't, they cause the most nightmares. Toilets, tills, credit card machines, parking, all of these issues are the things people go straight in on. And I'll come to you, Jim, now, thinking about what was a typical day like when you were head of operations?
Well, I think what I'd like to say in relation to this conversation, I would mirror and echo everything like fellow panelists have said about the unpredictability of it. But I think the other thing I'd like to make is things happen well because they're planned. And I think that's often overlooked, that actually, you know, a key part of this job, and we talked about things going wrong, but what happens when something goes wrong? And it's about actually monitoring that and evaluating that and understanding and how you can improve. And there is an enormous amount of you know, reviewing and evaluating, and David touched on it as well, I'm sure, the longer term planning. And I think that's part of the job that is sometimes underestimated.
I think that's definitely true. And brings us really nicely onto my next question, actually, which is, what do you think are some of the key skills you're using in operations roles? So planning, an ability to plan forward and think about the now and the future, as David has touched on, I think definitely are some of the skills. But what else might you point out? I'll start with you, Jim, if that's all right, on any other key skills you can think of. You're muted.
Hopefully not now. Yes, planning, organisation. I thought about this and jotted a few other things down. Obviously, communication, the ability to listen to people. But equally, I'd throw a few other things in there. I think team player is very critical. Taking decisions and taking responsibility is a key skill. But also allied to that is the ability to let other people make decisions and to be supportive of other people to make decisions. And I think probably the biggest one actually is what I would describe as honesty. And what I mean by that is seeing things as they actually are and listening to what your visitors and what your colleagues are saying and not being defensive about it. Being honest about your own performance, your own team's performance, and what actually is happening and what your visitors are experiencing, and being able to respond to that in the appropriate way.
I think that's brilliant and really crucial, that ability to kind of take accountability where it needs to be is really important. I see all of you nodding. Andrew, I wonder if you can reflect a bit on those key skills as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim put it perfectly. I really think that, especially, I want to echo the communication piece, because communication is often something that plagues organizations. Internal communication, either someone didn't tell the right person or they just saw it and they forgot. And so internal communication is a big part of operations. And I feel that oftentimes our departments are the ones that are just like driving that narrative of internal communication, how important it is, because it's one of those things where, like, if something does go wrong and we don't know about it, it takes twice as long to fix, or it causes a disruption or something like that. One of the things that I like to add that I always talk about is try not to be hard on yourself. You're going to work on a lot of projects and you're going to do a lot of different things, make a lot of decisions that aren't going to go well. And I've learned personally that dwelling on those and internalizing those just makes it worse, and it just makes coming to work a little harder, and it makes moving on to the next project more difficult. So it's one of those things where you take the loss, you take responsibility, like Jim said, and you fess up to, like, yep, that's my bad. But you got to move on. You got to focus on the next thing, because the world keeps turning. The museum's still open. People are still coming. So you can't dwell on those things.
That's really powerful and really reflects something we talked about in one of our sessions last night around what failure and success mean and identifying what those are. I think that's really important, and I think more museum roles could do with a heap of that. I think I see David was nodding particularly at in terms of communication, and I mean, you've got a massive team, so that must be quite the undertaking.
It is, and it's even harder when the team are all at home and we're not the kind of people that usually use a laptop, because the reason we took our jobs was we wanted to interact with people face to face on a daily basis. That's been one of the toughest things, I think. I mean, I would absolutely echo what Jim and Andrew have just said, really. I think the decisions and responsibility thing is something that's been, again, really key during this last year. It's amazing that to find you're suddenly one of the experts on COVID. Just because as an institution, you're the people, our teams are the people who are reading about what needs to be implemented and seeing the updates, and then having to communicate that to everybody, because it starts from us. So I think I've kind of, they're similar skills, but I've added, I think, enabler. I think in the communications, it is being diplomatic. Sometimes something isn't working and you're at the sharp end dealing with the visitors, and you have to feed back to someone who may have worked on the project for a couple of years from a curatorial perspective and just had this vision, and then it's nobody's fault, but it's just not quite working like that. So how can you build on the positives and really make sure that it actually delivers to the vision that person originally had when it comes into contact with the general public, who don't always perceive it or treat it as as it was envisaged when it was kind of discussed around a table or kind of on a whiteboard. So I think flexible, calm, positive. I don't like really personally the term resilient, because it makes it feel like you've just got to get used to dealing with the tough stuff. And I think, to Andrew's point, you know, we have bad days. So it's more about building on how do you remove as many of those friction points as possible, and just being constantly alert to what you can do to change that. And the final one I've got is you just need a really good poker face. So that when you're the duty manager and someone comes and tells you something truly disastrous has happened, you can say, it's fine, we've got this. Then go into a room, probably quietly cry for a second before you come out with a solution.
I think that might be where my career in operations stalled. I will look mortified. The rat in the toilet, I can't, it's shocking. I need to show it to you. Robin, you were nodding a lot about the idea of being an enabler, and I'd love to pick up on that in terms of skills with you.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I had down that was, I mean, all the other skills have already been mentioned, but enabler, I've said you need to know how to bring people along with you. So particularly in my job, I think, you know, I do a lot of sort of tactful convincing about museum standards and how things need to operate, because they're just not used to operating in that sort of way or role. As if you get a job in a museum, you sort of know you're going to be working with old things. Whereas when you get a job in a theater, you're not necessarily thinking that that's something you're going to be interacting with or doing. So for me, it is that sort of like, yeah, like knowing how and when, and being tactful in those ways. And I would also say it's about knowing what people want. So as David said, you know, I'm really lucky. I am the collections department at the RSC, so I get to do a lot of operations and curatorial stuff. So when I create exhibitions, I'm constantly thinking, what are people actually wanting to see? What do they want to know? So I think for me, that's been a really good part of my career, is just sort of stopping and going, what do people actually want to do? Why are people sitting on that concrete block outside of the Tate? Like, what are they getting from that? And trying to reflect that in their experience.
Definitely. I think, Will, you working in quite a community-based organization must have a lot of skills around that kind of community side of the work as well in your role.
Definitely. I think often we'll get, because we're a small museum, we're always moving about the museum, and we will get comments from the public about something that's wrong or something. And from working in front of house, you develop that skill set and that poker face to respond and sort of and understand the issue and sort of ensure that you will be working on it, and you know that will be. And I think that's one of the skills which you definitely need. And I think there's, alongside that, I found really useful just to checklist everything from my week to a day to a set of tasks which needs to be done in the morning. That's really helped in terms of like formalizing the checklist, making sure everything's done, making sure it's all in one system. And I guess the other thing from me was sort of coming into this role, and coming in from a front of house role where I wasn't involved in operations directly, was understanding my limitations and understanding the need for experts, and to listen and take account from like the air conditioning contractor or from the electrician about the issues your site has, and listening and taking that in and then responding to it based on that advice, and so accepting that you won't know everything and that you need this network of people around you. And again, that links in with your first point, Louise, around community. Is we've built relationships with a wide range of local, like electricians, plumbers who can come and who are local. And again, it allows the museum to work in a community as well through its operations, because you're supporting local businesses, you're supporting local networks of plumbers and electricians to utilize your site as well, rather than going to a contractor further afield.
Thanks. I think that's really interesting about kind of supporting the local economy where you can as well. I think that's a really nice kind of thing to do. I'm going to pivot a bit to a slightly different question. We've talked about the skills of the role, but what advice would you give to someone who wanted to work in operations? And as a sort of sub point of that, what do you think any particular qualifications are necessary? In museums, there's a lot of focus on qualifications, and it's already come up in the chat. So I want to just address with you, what advice would you give, and is it a qualification or is it something else? I will start with Robin this time, I think.
Yeah, I guess it sort of ties into what I said before about just knowing what people want. I think is a really good part of operations, and I don't think you need a qualification to do that, to observe just how people act and what, how they go about their daily lives, and how you can use that as a sort of tool to augment your visitor experience. I do have an undergraduate degree. It's not in museums, it's in English and French. And I actually got my first job because I did a French degree in museums. So in Canada, it's a bilingual country. So they just happened to want somebody who could do a tour in French as well as in English. And it was just beside me. So I was like, oh, great, I'll do this. But I wouldn't say that was a necessary requirement for me to get my foot in the door with museums. And I did do an MA. I came over to the UK to do MA in History and Interpretations of Art, which again isn't museum studies. And I would say wasn't particularly one of the reasons why I got into museums, but it was a door open to working at the Bristol Theatre Collection and seeing what that looked like, and that sort of drove me onto the path that I was on. But again, I wouldn't say that was a necessary qualification. I know that in a lot of job descriptions at the moment, people are starting to say or relevant experience or equivalent experience or a relevant sort of qualification. And I'm a real advocate for that, because I think that you some of the things you just don't learn in a classroom. You have to learn on the job. Yeah, that's my
That makes total sense. I think I'm going to come to David on this next, because you're coming from the other perspective into the sector, and I think it might be interesting to kind of hear what advice you would give on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a specific qualification. I think that's kind of I think that's one of the challenges actually of getting operations seen within the sector sometimes as the specialism that it is, because this is an oxymoron, I know, but it's a generic specialism. I think it's about being an all-rounder and being able to cope with lots of different things thrown at you. So some weeks you have to spend a lot of time gazing at spreadsheets and doing the finances. Other weeks we've talked about the fact that you are fixing the toilets. So I think for me, it is about comparative experience. So thinking about what you're dealing with, it's about customers in a broader sense. I know we like to call them visitors, but many of those people would identify as customers who are on our sites, and being able to express what it is those individuals need. And you can get that experience from kind of, many of us have our first job in the shop to earn some extra income. And that is, it's making sure you can really get the most out of that experience and bring those transferable skills. So I spent a lot of time when I first started working in the sector just referring back personally, not boring everyone else with it, to how we used to do stuff when I worked for Marks and Spencer's, because guess what? Rotas, they're really key to my life now, and they were then. Making sure the till's balance in retail is just as important when you're in a truly commercial environment as if you're in a commercial environment in your shops in a museum. So it does cross, I think, really clearly. And I think it's about people. I think if you can do anything, any kind of course, doesn't have to be a huge qualification, in managing and working with people, that's just hugely helpful. And there's a lot of free stuff out there that you can be involved in as well, and networks to learn more about visitor experience. So actually, when I'm looking for people to apply for roles in my team, that's the kind of stuff that I would look for. Over and above. I mean, I was lucky. I did a degree in heritage management and MA, but I did that after I was in the sector and I had the job, because it was something I was interested in doing and was fortunate enough to be able to do with the organisation that I worked with at the time. It gave me some insights, but I don't think it's necessary at all for the job that I do. And it's not something that's even been discussed in my interviews. It's always been about my experience.
I think that's really interesting. I'd love to hear whether the sector in America is similar in this. My perception of it is that it's much more qualification led, but I'd love to hear a bit about that from you.
Yeah, it's absolutely much more qualification led, and it's a very frustrating part of that, as everyone is aware of. And I am absolutely an advocate and agree with Robin and David that I do have I'm finishing my MA, but I don't need it for this job. I'm doing it because I'm interested in the sector, and it's just something that I was fortunate enough to be able to do. And I did it after I got into the sector. I truly believe that museums need to really look at all of their jobs and assess what the true qualification requirements are for those jobs. The museum that I currently work for, I'm very fortunate that they're a very community-focused organization, and they want members of the community here in Richmond to work for them. And so they very much right after I started, we looked at our qualifications for all of our jobs, and we adjusted the requirements from a degree standpoint as well as years experience. And we leaned more on years experience with transferable skills. So it's one of those things where our visitor services manager, it would be more of a customer service aspect, working with schedules or rotas or working with tills, that kind of experience we're looking for, more than someone having a bachelor's or a master's. And so I strongly believe and encourage all museums need to really audit those kinds of requirements in all their job descriptions, because I don't need a master. They're not teaching me anything about not even budgets. Like I don't even think there was a class on how to do a budget or work an Excel spreadsheet in grad school. So I spend a lot of time in Excel, an inordinate amount of time in Excel. It's just not necessary.
As I'm sure you can appreciate, Fair Museum Jobs is all for museums reappraising their job descriptions. That's our whole thing. Jim, I saw you smiling a bit there at the mention of Excel time. Is that one of the key skills you would encourage someone to get into if they want to do this kind of work?
Yes. There was a couple of really interesting comments. I want to make one point for the benefit. Hopefully this is useful. No, I wouldn't say qualifications are essential. I would echo what David and others have said about actually it's about experiences and people skills particularly. And certainly when I was recruiting, I wasn't really looking at qualifications. But I would also say that actually, a genuine interest and passion for the work is also important. I think it's underestimated sometimes that operations professionals, are museum professionals, and they take great pride in working for whoever they work for. So it's not a bad thing to be interested in the work of museums and visitors and what they do. But I wouldn't say qualifications were essential. No.
I'm going to come on to one of our other questions, and I'm going to start with Will. I will give you a heads up while I ask the question, because you were one of the people who raised this with me. I hope you don't mind me saying. This panel, unlike most of the panels that we're offering over the whole of this week at the summit, I think it's the only one that is mostly male. Which is not common in museums, certainly in the UK anyway. And I wondered if we could sort of think a bit about that, about what is it something about this area of work that might attract men more than women in the sector? I am going to, come to you first, Will.
Thank you. I think it's an interesting point, and if you look at the most recent research into the sector, 81% of the sector is female, or identifies as female, which already suggests that there's a disproportional balance comparatively here. And when I reflect on all the people I've worked with from outside the sector, like electricians, plumbers, they are all men. So I think there is something around which has led to this part of the heritage sector perhaps having more men in it. I don't know why. I don't know why it does. Museums are used by men and women. It's not it shouldn't be. And like one of the prime examples is how many museums have we been to where toilets haven't reflected the needs of both genders or genders people identify with. There's differences which need to be identified there as well, which I feel has been a result of like toilets not being designed correctly, not reflecting the time frames people use toilets for. There's a lot of questions, and I'm just giving more questions and answers to this point. I think there arguably there's a demand to make it more balanced.
Thanks. I think they're really interesting reflections on what it is that operations means and what those jobs are. I am going to come to you, Robin, not in a context of the only woman on this panel, excluding chairing doesn't count. But I do wonder if you have any reflections on this from your experience.
Yeah, completely. Actually, when I read this question, when you sent it out to us beforehand, I sort of had to do a second take and reread the panel people again, because in my experience, every single job I have worked at, I have had a female head of operations or a female director of the site. So I've really had the opposite experience, and admittedly, I'm a bit on the fringes. But even now, the head of operations at the RSC is a female. My director of my department is female. So yeah, it really did struck me thinking, why is the panel more male than female? Because in my experience, there's been a lot of females who have occupied the role, and I mean, in my experience, they have all done an incredible job, and I would advocate for them completely and totally. So yeah, I'm a bit sort of still musing on the question, really.
I know. I mean, it is interesting. It was interesting for us at Fair Museum Jobs as well, because I mean, it was an open call for people, and operations was one of the topics, and there just was not as many. It was men who were coming forward to talk about that. So I do wonder if it's a self-selecting thing about what you want to talk about. I saw David as well nodding a lot. I suspect you may have something to offer.
I think it's really interesting. I don't have answers, but I was kind of reflecting on my own team and the operational team, the duty managers. We're a 50-50 split of male and female across my two sites, and in fact, the audiences director who I report into is female, and all my senior team are. So I'm kind of the odd one out in that context in where I sit. But I was reflecting on, because operations is such a broad basket, actually. It means so many different things at different sites. I mean, I'm not currently responsible for security, but I was in previous roles. And I just know whenever I was recruiting in security, the vast majority of applicants would be male, would come from a police or other security background, and they'd be moving into this sector as a kind of a second career. And I think that was quite common. So although I did see it start to change, and my security team in my last job became much more balanced, gender balanced over time. And I just think that we're almost kind of waiting for other sectors to catch up, and that then feeds through to us. I wonder whether that's had an impact in areas like security and thinking about estates, because I would agree with Will. Every time we put a radio call out for someone to come and fix a lift or whatever, it's nearly always a male member of the team. So I think perhaps it's about how you define operations and where we pull talent from, and perhaps it's also about looking more widely in some of those areas.
That's really interesting. Definitely. I think there's a lot. I mean, part of me regrets the question and part of me doesn't, because it is something to unpack. But then I think about my experience, and I've worked mostly with a lot of women in the sector. Jim, I'll come over to you. Do you have any reflection to share on this as well?
Nothing particularly original, I don't think. Certainly my experience as well would reflect what's been said here. I've worked with many female colleagues across the operations team, and more increasingly so in areas that you might think had traditionally more male in terms of estates and security and so forth. And I think actually the point I think was again David made, I think part of this as well may be about external factors, and one of the things I think might be an interesting question to ask is where services are outsourced or insourced. That might be, and a good question to ask when you're looking actually at who to contract to do things.
Definitely, I think we'll outsourcing is quite common in some of the areas that will come under operations more so than any others. So that is definitely something to think about when you're contracting those services. I'm going to ask one of the questions that we have from the chat, and I'm going to come to you, Andrew, on this first. How has your role changed this year with all of what 2020 encompasses for you?
Yeah. So I'm in a very unique position. I actually started this job in May at the Valentine. So yeah, so I started in the middle of a global pandemic, which was a very interesting way to start a job. I got here in May, and I've been on site the majority of the time just because of the nature of museum operations and having to learn a new job. The majority of my time was spent in reopening prep. When I first got here, it was like half. It was divided into thirds. It was a third learning my job, a third making sure that things were still operable, and then a third reopening prep. And so I spent May and June prepping like sneeze guards and one-way directional signages and hand sanitizer, so much hand sanitizer, and I think that one of the things that's really changed is, at least my experience with operations in general, is the realization from a lot of departments about how integral operations is, and they're starting to understand that like it doesn't just happen. Like we make it appear like it just happens, like the toilet paper is just refilled or the trash can's emptied or this is clean. That's the way it's supposed to be, but they're realizing with everything that's happened and the amount of work and effort that we're putting into prep, that reopening, that it's not just some fairy that goes around and does it. And I think there's also for me, there was a really morbid reality to operations this year, because we spent my first 2 months here at the Valentine reopening or prepping to reopen. And literally the day that we reopened, we had a senior leadership meeting, and our director looked at us and said, okay, what do we need in case we close again? And it was just this immediate flip of thinking, and it's just accepting the reality of what we're in, and so it's been a weird year for everyone. So it's just been odd.
I'm going to pose the same question to Will, and I know you had a similar experience of being ready to open and then a local lockdown coming into place. So that must have been complicated.
Yeah, it was. So we were originally planning to reopen in September. We had got to a point now where we had said we had a provisional opening date, and we were monitoring the rates in our local area, and almost like trying to forecast where it was going using the like Public Health Wales sort of information. And we were getting aware of it. We were discussing as a team what would have to happen. And we made the call, I think, probably a day before the local authority went into local lockdown to postpone our reopening. We made it clear that why we were closing and postponed it for what was, it turns out, 2 months. And I think our communication was clear. And I think because of that, the community recognised that and understood why we were delaying it. But it didn't take anything away from the work we had done to get the museum there. It was the first time the museum had been ready to reopen since March. I think that's something which we all should be celebrating, really, is that throughout lockdown, from that very first day in March, operations have been planning reopening from that point onwards, and whilst also checking the site, ensuring it's secure. Operations have been there throughout, and it's a fantastic achievement for the sector and the recognition of work of operations. And it's been a learning curve, learning about what you need is bringing in new contractors, people designing like perspex screens fitted to your desk. Your desk is in many museums is unique, so you got to get often get personally designed perspex. I spent ages designing on Canva different signs for reopening, putting into museum branding and stuff, and then also drafting like statements for public. It's been a learning curve on language and what we have to say, plus also monitoring all the different factors, like going out of local lockdown, national lockdown in Wales 2 weeks ago, and setting this reopening date. And now today and this week is about reflecting on that and seeing what we need to do going forward, whether all the systems are working, whether one-way systems are working, are the stickers sticking to the floor properly. We're still on that learning curve now, but it definitely has changed how we operate around the museum and what we need to do.
And I imagine, David, it's the same for you, but on a different scale to for Will.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it is very much the same. As Will said, you know, we went straight from how do we close down to how do we reopen. Obviously, quite often the government update on what's going to happen comes out the evening before, so that can be a challenge. We had a lot of meetings about face masks and what our policy was going to be on them for the public, and then by the time we got to it, the law had changed anyway. So I think there's that whole thing. What we've really learned is about focusing on what you can deal with and not what you can't. I think you kind of quite often end up talking about that with front of house teams who can beat themselves up because we didn't think of X or Y. So we can't think of everything. We have to try, but we're not going to get, we're going to maybe get 80% of it right. I think big changes that kind of culturally, which I'm sure everyone else has found, is no one's ever been so interested in my business continuity plans. So that's a big tick. All of a sudden, the risk assessments, everyone wants to complete a risk assessment, whereas previously you'd sometimes have someone's arm twisted behind their back to get them to share that. And everyone is talking about visitor flow and social distancing and how many people you should have in an exhibition. So for years, I think the sector's been debating, particularly with things like blockbusters, what's a good visitor experience. And we might be saying, well, we understand the commercials, but on the other hand, some of what we do isn't as good as it could be because there's too many people in a space. And now all of a sudden, people are really taking note and getting into the detail of that. So if there's positives to come out of it, I think it will be in those areas where we're kind of much better equipped for the future. Hopefully we don't have to deal with another pandemic, but what we've learned and what we've done for visitor experience, it's accelerated some things that I think perhaps we wanted to do for quite a long time. I'm not sure how I feel about QR codes, but they seem to be dead and buried a while ago, and now they're back and everyone seems to be using them, and they're definitely adding to the experience in some areas of our site, and they're an effective way to do things. So again, much more inventive, I think, and being led by visitors. We're always trying, I think all of us always try and push the visitor viewpoint, but at the moment, because that comes through so strongly with how visitors feel about particular areas around COVID safety, social distancing, how many people should be in a space, whether they should have an audio guide, etc. It's really, that's all bubbled up, and I think people are taking a lot more notice, actually.
I think some people have been commenting on that in the chat as well, about how sort of this year has put a focus on this area of work in a way that it wasn't before. And someone very rightly makes the point that hopefully that will lead to more resources for these areas as well, because you can't just make a site safe with 2p and a piece of string. So hopefully that will also help. I'm going to pose the last question now, and we'll need to be fairly succinct if we can, I hope. But it is quite a big question. What are the best and worst parts about working in this area of work? And I'm going to come to Robin first.
I just think it's the interaction with people, meeting so many new people, getting to know people's opinions, their likes, their interests, what's driving them. That's something that I'm quite passionate about myself, just as an interest. What do people like doing? For me, that's the best part of the job, and being able to sort of affect that and change to people's experiences is for me the best part of the job. The worst part of the job, honestly, I would say that when I started out in museums, volunteering was sort of like you just did it, and it sort of merged on the edge of people volunteering for a role that they should be paid for. And I think in terms of operations, when you're in a smaller organization or an organization that doesn't necessarily give you all of the resources to be able to pay people for work, it's that line between, you know, what is a volunteer role and what is something that actually is paid work, and how do you advocate for that afterwards. And yeah, I think in the last section we were talking about like micro volunteering and stuff like that, and I think it is starting to merge from that, but I would say from my past experience that was sort of personally one of the things that I've always grappled with.
Thanks. And Jim, what would you say is the best and worst?
I'll concentrate on the worst because it's just the point I wanted to make, particularly in relation to what this summit is all about. The worst is the expectation, if you're in operations, when 5 o'clock comes, you're still available. The idea that you can be contacted any time of the day, any time of the night, and I think sometimes operations professionals don't help themselves in that, because I've seen that sort of culture of, don't worry, get in touch, we'll sort it out, we'll come and sort it out. But actually, it's really exclusionary. And I have seen lots of jobs that expect people to be totally on call, to be able to respond quickly, to live close to the venue. So if, for example, you've got caring responsibilities, child responsibilities, it really is something that I was very conscious of, and I think it's something that I would flag the sector needs to look at.
That is a fabulous, amazing point to make. It is exclusionary to have those kinds of expectations. And I saw the whole panel nodding a lot. Andrew, I wonder if you can reflect on that or your own best and worst.
Yeah, no, I agree with Jim about the worst. That's holidays I've been called about something happening. When I started a job and I wasn't even in the city yet, and I get a call from one of my security officers there. It was just like, we got a big problem. And I was like, well, I don't live there yet, so I really can't assist you at this moment. So I definitely agree that's the worst. Ironically, I think that my best is Robin's worst, because I feel that being in operations, being so intertwined in the other departments gives us such a capacity for institutional change. I think that we have the ability to create new ways to think about how the museum functions and fix those systemic problems. At MoCA, I created an entirely new entry-level job scheme that I implemented there that replaced the visitor services team and made them more intertwined throughout the whole organization. And so I find that the ability to be inventive and try to address those issues, at least on an institutional level, very rewarding and fun.
And David, if you can do your best and worst in 10 words or less.
Okay, worst, I think Jim kind of did nail it there. But the other element for me is that I never, when we're doing a new exhibition and a curator tells me that we're doing 17th century art, for example, I never debate that. I accept they know what they're doing. But when I say you can only put 5 people in this room safely, I always get an email back going, can't we make it 6? So it's about people understanding that I do know what I'm talking about and it's founded on fact. But the best is just the range of stuff you get involved in. I mean, there is nothing that goes on the sites that I can't stick my nose into, and my team can't be involved in delivering. So that's fantastic. Brilliant.
And Will, I will give you the final word on best and worst as our closer.
Worst, I would say, is same as David, is our undervaluation. I think in my role, I don't feel much, but across the wider operations front of house sector, that feeling of undervalued and as not being trusted as specialists when they undoubtedly are. And I think the best is the amount of data operations in front of house have at their fingertips. You're in the opportunity, you can control, visitor numbers, depending on what your role finance is coming in and out. You have so much data, and being able to use that data to advocate for front of houses and operations, it has potential to be really powerful.
Thank you. That is a lovely note to end on. And I'll just read a comment from the chat, which you can debate afterwards. Operations is the backbone of the museum service. Collections is the heart. I'll let you take that away to Twitter for further debate. I'd like to thank all of the panel for their amazing contributions and early starts in some cases. And thank you all for attending. And we will close this session now. Thank you so much.